This is the Open University.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3.
Why I am not gonna buy the 2018 MacBook Air. This is the Open University. You haven't tuned into the wrong channel. I've been trying to hype myself up because I've got money now. I've actually got some money in the bank. I've been trying to hype myself up to replace my 4-year-old computer. I've been using a MacBook Air, which I bought in 2014. And I'm just not really able to do it. I'm not able to get to the level of excitement to go to the Apple Store here in Berlin and buy the new MacBook Air 2018. It's got a brighter screen. Actually, it's not brighter. I think it's a dimmer screen. It's got better sound. But, you know, I've got a huge screen because I project my old one onto the wall. So it's feet across, not just inches. And I put the sound through my really good sound system and so on. So, in fact, what it boils down to is that this would be a replacement computer, which all it would really add, apart from some screen resolution, would be this biometric thing of being able to read your fingerprint. This is what the innovations of computers seem to be these days, that they are getting more into the kind of concerns that we meet at borders and frontiers. When we come to a new country, we meet immigration, we meet customs. They want to fingerprint us, they want to take a photograph of our faces now. Anti-terrorist measures, money laundering measures. And this is what computers now do for us. They used to advertise in the 90s that they were going to come in colors and they were going to make us more creative. They were multimedia. They were going to make us all television producers and things, which to some extent they have. But it's really just a question of how much you need to keep renewing your machine. And I look back at the machines I've had. Yes, this thing of biometrics being the major advance. Okay, so you can buy things with just your finger. Great, I looked back at the pattern of my purchases of computers over the last 30 years, because it's really interesting. I've been tithing 20% of my income to Apple each year, and it started in 1987. Not to Apple, actually, to Amstrad, which I think was Alan Sugar's company, right? I got a PCW word processor with LocoScript, and I was writing, I shot off letters to everybody. I was kind of obsessed. Well, first of all, it was fascinating that you could copy, cut, paste, that suddenly texts had this kind of fluidity which they didn't really have before. Obviously you could edit before, but you'd have to rewrite everything when you edited it, and that was a real hassle. So this ease of editing, digital editing, was the major revelation of that first computer for me. And it's something I applied later, actually in my second computer, which I got in 1990, 3 years later, which was a proper computer, but it was an Atari STE 1040. So I used that initially just for sequencing music, and it was used in tandem with an Akai sampler, an S900 sampler. And that was the application to music and to composition in music of this principle of cut, copy, paste. And that was amazing because I could make a whole new kind of music. Instead of just putting chord sequences together on guitars, you could make these electronic samples of other records, any sound you wanted, and sort of rejig it. Essentially collage it into a new music. In 1993, well, two things happened. I started going to Japan, but also I got, oh yes, I should say, I got my first Apple in 93, and it was a Duo Dock. This amazingly expensive computer. It cost £3,000. I was starting to get money then somehow, working for Japanese projects like the Boys and Girlfriend album. And I bought this thing which was a laptop that slotted into a desktop. So it was black and white screen on the laptop, and it was a colour screen on the desktop. And it cost £3,000, which in today's money is about £6,000. So a lot of money, more than I would ever spend on a computer now in terms of proportion of my income. But I was going to say that with the Atari, I was able, my sort of gateway to Apple's was, there was this little plug-in ROM thing which you could put into the side of the Atari, and then it would emulate, if you had the system disks for Apple OS 6, I think it was at the time, on the other side in the floppy drive, you could actually make it emulate an Apple. So I started in a very clumsy and basic way with just 500k of RAM, I think it was, something like that, 512. to get into the Apple ecosystem. And that is, to this day, that is what keeps me snared into their rather increasingly oppressive, actually, ecosystem of, the iTunes store and all the rest of it, which I hate and try to disable as soon as I can. But obviously OS X is still the compelling thing about Apple's, and I want to stay in that environment. But what I noticed looking at these stats, because then I had a string of, the boring John Scully vanilla box type Apples. In 95, I got a Power Macintosh 7500. In 97, I got a 9500. I mean, each of these, it's kind of interesting, each of these, because in computer years, it's a very different time scale. So the 90s was a time of enormous expansion, very, very kind of obsessive digital expansion. History seemed to be going very fast. A couple of years in the product cycle seemed to introduce all sorts of new things. Computers they were learning, they were acquiring the five senses that we humans had one by one. At first, computers were just doing spreadsheets and doing word processing, but they learned to hear, they learned to speak and make sounds, and they learned to, they haven't learned to smell yet, or to taste, I guess, but they are getting more of these senses, So they became multimedia, and that was exciting because as a musician, I could make more and more of my music with computers. So I associate the Power Macintosh 7500 in 1995 with making my website, making CD-ROMs like This Must Stop. I was sort of influenced by people like Blam, who were putting out CD-ROMs through Voyager at the time. And I thought this was the future of packaged media, as we called it then. I remember George Michael was sort of complaining about Sony treating him like software, because Sony also had software concerns at the time. And I thought, well, that is what music is. It is just a branch of software. I don't think we should be precious about music being this separate culture. Why shouldn't it all get mixed up with visuals and interactivity? But the Blam slogan was actually interactivity is a lie. And they like to play with a kind of behaviorist, determinist idea of there being just the illusion of choice and, click this or click that, remix David Bowie's Jump CD-ROM, but, was it really interactive? You were given such limited choices in those days. Click around Myst, there were very few things you could do except do stupid puzzles. But what was important about Myst was the atmosphere. And it was the same with some of the CD-ROMs I started buying in Japan and bringing back to Europe, like I guess Gadget, which was a kind of a steampunk CD-ROM, or else Alice by Kuniyoshi Kaneko, which was a kind of mysteriously pedophile CD-ROM, with these unsettling paintings which you would progress from one to the other. Kaneko's paintings, fantastic, interpreting Lewis Carroll's world. But also Rodney's Wonder Window, which was this kind of childish, psychedelic world you could enter, play puzzles, and also Pop-Up Computer. I think I still have that here somewhere. Amazing Japanese CD by the people who went on to make Parappa Rapper for the PlayStation. So a lot of this creativity moved over into computer games a bit later on. But those were all very inspirational pieces of software for me, and they sort of fed into what I was trying to do when I taught myself to use Macromedia Director at that point. I was also learning HTML, so there are all these new languages of creation. When did I last learn a language of creation? My website still has the same basic HTML now that I wrote for it in 1995. I think the simplicity is a virtue, but there isn't that same sense of rapid expansion. So what I found, looking at the stats of how many computers I've owned, I think 12 computers over 30 years. So you can see that's between a 2 and 3 year cycle of renewing. But in the 90s, it's 2 years, because things seem to be moving faster, and each new generation of computers seems to be able to do more, a lot more. And there were exciting breakthroughs. In 1997, my Power Macintosh is a tower desktop computer, but it has a flat screen monitor, which I paid £900 for, an Apple flat screen monitor. I was one of the first people I knew who had a flat screen monitor. I also had a projector. I had an always-on internet connection in the form of ISDN, which was the precursor to DSL. Before anyone else, everybody else was still dialing up with their modems going, to get online and to pay for the phone bill at the end of the month. But at that moment, I also had a Nokia communicator, which meant that I had a web-capable smartphone in 1997. I was sort of flush with cash from my Japanese hits, and I was spending it all on gadgets. I was also having terrible problems with my eye and having operations and things, so these gadgets were in a sense a consolation for the physical infrastructure of my body deteriorating at the same time. So in a way, I was enhancing with digital technology that sort of lacks the beginning of the crumbling of my physical body, taking photographs, suddenly getting really into digital photography from 97 onwards, for instance. That was very exciting because I hadn't taken photographs since my teenage years, my early 20s. I sort of stopped doing that and shifted to a more literary frame. But I really got back into photography in a big way when it became cost-free, essentially. And there was a guy called Kohei, a Japanese designer, who came to London and Paris and hung out with me and my friends Tug and Flo, and really impressed me with his Apple, what was it called? Quick Cam or whatever it was called, the early Apple thing that actually could make 12 digital photographs on one floppy disk, which you could then read on your computer. And they were very low resolution. They were, 500K or less. And you could print them out, but it made you gravitate towards a certain kind of composition, that sort of photography. The limitations of that photography actually had to become strengths. So I would take a lot of graphic flat. And flatness, of course, was something I was suddenly very aware of because I lost 3D vision at about the same time this was happening. So the world was all suddenly flat for me. And that was a real consolation, having this kind of digital supplement to my vision. And then in 1999, Steve Jobs comes back to Apple, and that's a fantastic moment for all of us, because this boring kind of John Scully vision, I mean, he had some vision about knowledge navigators and things. He sort of, the Newton was an attempt to make a smartphone about 10, 15 years before it was possible. I bought a Newton, I had a Newton, which I used for nothing. I mean, all it could do was handwriting recognition with a stylus. They've only now brought back the stylus with the new iPad Pro, which has a pen, a magnetic pen that sort of drops onto the side of it, and you can draw really nicely with it. But that's, in a way, just picking up what John Scully was trying to do with the Newton. But Steve Jobs came back, and then suddenly there was all this burst of colour, and at least formally anyway. And in terms of the associations in the advertising, for instance, big pictures of John Lennon, saying "think different," or Einstein or whatever. There was this sense of, we are the standard bearers for creativity. We're bringing a new renaissance. Computers are going to unleash your creativity. And of course now it's all biometrics and it's all identity and it's all halt, who goes there? Are you the right person? Do you have the right genetic profile? Can we test your fingerprint? It's totally become a totally different emphasis post the death of Steve Jobs. So I really bought into the Steve Jobs vision, obviously, as an artist, as a creator, think different. Hey, why not? Let's all think different. So I bought one of the tangerine clamshell iBook, the first iBook. And that was the end, really, of my desktop period. I adopted this idea of portability. But of course, what was portable, what was considered portable back then is not really what we think of as portable now, post the MacBook Air. They were big, heavy, clunky bits of agricultural machinery, basically. And luckily, the clamshell iBook had a handle, so you could carry it around like a briefcase. But it was this big thing. And I went through several of the white monobod, what do you call them, snow, the iBook G3, and I had two iBook G4s. So these big, white, heavy plastic chunks became my main computer in the time when I was blogging. The noughties were for me the time of click opera and blogging and intelligent discourse and opinion on the internet. A kind of seminar, a bit like what I'm doing now in video, but this is a monologue. This is not really, there isn't really the comment culture that there used to be in the noughties. So I then, actually, in the middle of that blogging period, in early 2007, I got a 24-inch iMac, huge screen. So this, I blogged on the day I got it. I unboxed it. I had an unboxing blog, and it shows me taking it out and saying, this is my new window on the world, in a sort of McLuhanite way, saying that, I admit that the technology of the time dictates how we see the world. This was very much how I was being brought to visions of the world, encadrement, framings of the world, was through things like digital photography or the size of screen, the resolution of screen you have. It's really interesting going back to an old computer. My G4, one of my G4 MacBooks still works, iBooks still works, and I kind of loaded it up and it's instantly 2007. The picture on the screen is of the Palais de Tokyo with some paper lamp shades, and the way the icons look and the way the browser looks and everything is just you're just instantly in that different era, and you realize how much your perceptions are dictated by what the era is technologically making available to you. So you see the world not just in the frame of the computer screen itself and how much resolution it has, what kind of colors it has, what kind of depth it has, whether it's tactile or not. Tactility, of course, was the next big jump through. I actually was a technology correspondent for Wired, for the Wired website, Hot Wired, at the time as well, earning my money that way. And I cried. I admitted to crying when Steve Jobs introduced the first iPhone. And it was mainly this gesture when he took a photograph and he showed that you could expand the photograph with your fingers. That was really what did it for me, that idea that suddenly data was tactile. You could actually touch it, or you had the illusion of touching it. It's all very clever animation and all the rest of it, but it's a data wrangling, but it gave you this sense. But in a way, this was the beginning of a kind of degradation of the experience, because the internet became finger food. It became a sort of fast food McDonald's, that you would eat. You eat everything. You eat the data with your fingers from that point onwards. So it became a kind of informality took over, and so my whole kind of vision of internet seminars and very intelligent people typing on their desktops, that sort of went out the window, and people just were much more attuned to instant, fast fire, like Twitter and Facebook, the stuff that people put up on Facebook, high impact but low effort. Not really any sense of a lot of habit and a lot of routine, a lot of daily input, which is fatic, as we say, or fatic, I think it's pronounced. So it's the beginning of the end of my interest, to be honest, in the internet. I now feel, when I think about getting new technology, I feel as I do about television and radio sets, that whatever technologies they now have don't interest me, because I know that the software, the programming, is not to my taste. I'm not interested in what the radio does mostly. I'm interested in radio as an idea for a medium, but I'm not interested in what's actually done with it, and the same with television. So the internet is almost getting to the stage where, despite its infinite possibilities, the actual daily experience of using it is degraded, and you feel a bit dirty. You feel like you need to take a shower after looking at your Facebook feed or Twitter or whatever it is. And you also associate it with this rise in populism and the sort of stupid opinion culture where anyone's opinion is apparently as good as anyone else's and all the rest of it. I had this thing I said in Wired, just before I was fired from Wired, for talking about Apple, actually. I was fired from Wired for running a column about the Apple Get a Mac campaign and saying that the hipster Apple character, who of course I approved of and identified with, and who's posited against this Bill Gates kind of square, who's into accountancy and spreadsheets and just doesn't understand the creativity of computers. Very, very difficult to imagine that campaign running in today's climate, where the Apple guy would have to be saying, well, hey, my computer knows who I am biometrically. It's like my computer's a better border guard than your computer. My computer knows who is authorized and who is not authorized. He's a great security guard. It wouldn't really work, would it? But I wrote a column saying that the Get a Mac campaign harked back to Norman Mailer's essay from 1956 or whenever it was, The White Negro, and saying that the idea of being a hip computer draws from black culture. So I was sort of playing the race card, and I was also saying embarrassing things about an advertiser who was at that very moment putting banner ads across the Hot Wired site. So I lost my job because of that. Fine, it's fine. These things change. You move on. I remained an Apple loyalist, and so in this decade, I've actually slowed down. See, what I noticed when I looked at the stats is that I had, in the 90s and the noughties, the really digital decades, I had two computers. I had every 2 years a new computer, whereas in the 80s, well, I didn't really. I had just one computer then, but in the other decades, I have fewer. I have like one every 3 years, and currently I'm 4 years and counting, and without buying a new computer. What I did last year, or actually, yeah, in 2016, I bought a retro 15-inch MacBook Pro second-hand from 2011, so it was already 4 years out of date, but it ran fine. So what I found is there's been a balkanization. There's no longer my computer, which is my central computer. There's a balkanization through all sorts of handheld gadgets, through an iPhone, through an iPad, putting the laptop itself into a sound system, connecting it to a projector. Wi-Fi obviously gives you the sense that data is everywhere. There are, a lot of it's a balkanization, not just of data on the internet. That there are so many websites and apps, especially apps, have really balkanized the landscape of the web. But also the technology, the hardware itself, is balkanizing through your flat, and by that word I obviously mean, Serbia, Montenegro, North Montenegro, whatever it's called this week. That is really what we're doing with technology as well. The Balkans scenario is that there are all these there's a splitting. This decade I've only had one MacBook Air 13-inch, one MacBook Air 11-inch, which is my favorite computer ever because it's the lightest, the smallest, and I call it the hardest working laptop in showbiz because it does everything I need to do. I can make albums on that, I can make videos like this on that. It is just sufficient. It is the idea of the just in time or the just sufficient rather than the over endowed. I don't need to do 4K video editing or whatever it is the new computers can do. Of course, if I had more money, I would get a more capable computer, but I think it's really a question of looking in your soul and saying, am I excited about what technology is doing now? And the answer for me now is no, I'm not excited. I'm much more, I think to myself, should I really tithe my 1,500 euros to Apple this year, or should I buy 1,500 euros worth of secondhand books or weird ponchos, And actually, the ponchos win.
Open University.